Joel. So Joel is an associate professor in the University of Maryland's College of Information Studies and Human Computer Interaction Lab. And he focuses on enabling a future where informed innovation is accessible to everyone. And he's doing this with a focus on human-centered design of novel information systems such as search engines and knowledge management systems in the domains of scientific discovery and design. And before he joined the University of Maryland, he was a postdoc and a scientist in the Human Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And he received his PhD in cognitive psychology at the University of Pittsburgh. So with that, Joel, please take it away.
Sure. All right. Like I said before the recording turned on, it's really cool to see so many friends here. This is a great group. Great way to end my last week before everything comes crashing in when the semester starts next week. So grateful for this opportunity. It's been a long time coming. So some preliminary expectations here. I don't know if you're expecting a polished talk, but you're not going to get it. This is a chat, and I put in a bunch of leads and trails here for us to follow, but we don't have to follow all of them. So this is a very informal, hypertextual, nonlinear chat. So please interrupt and engage liberally. It's totally fine if we don't get through all of the notes. There's a lot more here that we actually cover in our 49 minutes left that I'd rather hear from you. You can always explore around here. We can continue the conversation on Discord. The other thing I will say is that good question from Rubayat. This is my notebook. It's a hypertext notebook. And if you're curious about all these little formalisms here, I'm actually following a HCII flavored discourse graph formalism where I try to sort of pull out specific kinds of information and tag them as specific kinds of nodes and connect them in a graph that actually helps me think through things. So it's kind of a research question. There are claims that I want to sort of track. There's specific empirical results that I want to track, design patterns and specific artifacts. And that sort of powers our research program and how we think about things. So if you're curious about what those little colors and markers mean, that's what they mean. So kind of meta. Talking about incremental formalization, but I'm actually showing it in action as well. Okay, so let's dive in. I don't know how much I can assume in terms of people having done the reading. So please interrupt me if you want to sort of jump ahead. But I thought at a high level we can do sort of three things. We can sort of begin with unpacking the intuition for this idea of incremental formalization, and that really kind of takes us through the Shipman paper, Shipman and Marshall, with some commentary attached. I'd love to share a little bit about how we're actually finding this design principle extremely powerful in our current projects. And then I think it'll be fun to brainstorm about what this might look like right now with more capable AI. I think there's a lot of fun, exciting sort of ideas here. So you are welcome to push me in any of these directions. Whatever's interesting would be best. So let's start with the incremental formalization idea. So this is kind of based on the Shipman paper as a core guide. I'm just going to kind of walk through some of the highlights. So we have shared idea. So the key initial foundational claim, which we could contest if you want, is this assumption that if you want computers to help us with knowledge work, super helpful to have some kind of abstraction and formalization. It's probably not controversial in this group, but worth stating up front because one thing you might conclude from reading this paper is that we should just do away with formalism altogether. I don't think that is the right conclusion, but the idea is that if we have some formalization, then we have lots of cool things that the computer can help with, adding more computational power, using the structure to collaborate, enabling more sort of computation and stuff. So that's a key foundational claim. And this was really connecting to the context of what Shipman and Marshall were working on in the 80s. Lots of people are excited about hypertext systems, which are kind of, think of Wikipedia if you're not familiar with it, but the earlier versions of it that were sort of single user, really focused on thinking. And then thinking about argumentation models like Tolman structures and so on to really structure thinking. And the vision was, hey, people could think a lot better if we had tools that supported the way they think and enable them to structure thinking in explicit ways. There were two sort of key example systems back in the day. One was note cards, which it turns out you can, let me drop a link in the chat if you want to play around with it. There's a working online demo of this system. But it kind of looks like this spatial hypertexty place. If you're familiar with HyperCard, it's kind of that similar idea where you have like this space and you can create these little cards and connect them, right? So it's basically a visual like spatial hypertext. And turns out people actually use this. There was some compelling usage. This paper describes actual usage of writers using this system to map out their writing. There's a longitudinal study of history graduate student using note cards to write a research paper over a period of 7 months. One of my favorite sort of descriptions of usage was in the 80s by this theorist, Kurt Van Len, who sort of dumped his entire theory book into note cards and then used note cards to refine his theory and sort of use the formalism to sort of discover key weaknesses in his hypotheses. Right, switching from outline to matrix view. This is like a fun little thing here where you have sort of create this like Cartesian product of hypotheses versus evidence and then identifying weaknesses, which you can't do in an outline. So switching these representations was enabled by the formalism. And then the Aquanet system, which was developed by Marshall and Rogers in the 90s, where they try to sort of integrate more explicitly sort of argumentation formalisms to sort of support people to map out their thinking in this way. They were not as excited about the usage of their tools. One of the important papers that came out of this work was this, I don't know why it's 1992 in the Shipman paper, but I think the citation is actually 1993. But one key thing that they didn't like was that people like to cluster things. So instead of like creating this like formal link structures with like argumentation relations and so on, people just like to make cards and cluster them informally. And so a lot of this structure was left implicit. Probably not surprising to a lot of us, but it was quite disappointing to the researchers at the time, because the hope was if you have these like structures and relations, you can sort of start to do formal reasoning over it, some computational reasoning to support identification of contradictions, weaknesses in your argument, and so on, which you can't do if you just have implicit links. So they were pretty upset that they couldn't get people to do this to the level they wanted. There's some other related formalisms or systems you might be familiar with. So the IBIS, or issue-based information system for policy formulation was a major one back in the day. A dark horse, really interesting system that saw a lot of use in practice was called Compendium. You can still download the Java application right now. I don't know where the community is, but this was a robust community for a long time. And then there was the questions, options, and criteria scheme, where you sort of use this formalism to map out a design rationale. So this was pretty active in the 80s and 90s, and kind of died out because they really, well, we're going to talk about the problems identified in this paper, right? This paper describes why, a big reason why the field sort of moved on. And yeah, so for me personally, I read this paper after committing all the sins described in this paper for a couple of years. And like bashing my head against the wall. It's like, why can't I get people to do this stuff? Like, you know, it's so hard. And I read this paper. I was like, man, I should have. Why didn't I read this like two years ago? There's a little YouTube video I made of this like system of what I call a graph maker, right? You decompose papers into like problems and solutions, and like turns out like it was very, very restrictive formalism, and people wanted to do all kinds of other things alongside it, which after reading this paper. And I care about ideas now because I'm actually using these ideas to build a new infrastructure for scholarly communication based on a formalism that's more granular than documents, to enable sort of scientific sense making at scale and collaborative sense making. I also think it's a really exciting time to think about this now. One of my favorite design patterns is to take old ideas like that were ahead of their time and then reconsider them in light of like, oh, maybe things are different now. And I do think things are different now. So I think it's really exciting to consider this idea. Okay, so that's some context. So useful to kind of talk about the central argument first. This idea of like formalism considered harmful, right? The intuition is that there's this risk of imposing too much formality from our users as designers. We're like excited, just like Marshall, like, hey, we could get these like awesome, contradiction detection or whatever. And if only users would just specify their ideas in these like structures. It turns out that's often a pipe dream and sometimes harmful to the task itself. So useful to kind of talk through the helpful sort of four components of this idea. One I think is fairly obvious, which is this kind of cognitive overhead idea. This is in section 3.1, right? Any formalism needs to be learned, right? So that's number one, pretty obvious. And then even if you have learned it, you need to execute it. This is kind of Norman's like gulp of execution idea. And this is where, there's like some intrinsic cognitive load of I need to actually think about how to map my stuff to the formalism, right? Like how do I chunk it into the right thing? How do I map it? So there's this sort of nice description of this in this paper by Simon Buckingham-Shum in 1997, talking about the specific subcomponents of this cognitive load, right? I need to unbundle my stuff into components. I need to classify them into the formalism components. I need to name them, right? No more like untitled 1, untitled 2, untitled 3. I need to actually like name what the thing is and then like structure ideas in the scheme. And this takes effort, which needs to have some corresponding payoff. Then there's the interaction cost, right? And that's like nice target for us as HCI people to like, can we make it easier to actually specify the structure, but there's some intrinsic cost to using a formalism, which I would argue is actually often quite good, right? To stop and think like, hey, what am I actually thinking here? But intrinsically, there's some load here. This one I'm not going to spend as much time on. There's this like argument that for some tasks, you actually don't want to force people to make tacit knowledge explicit. If you want to discuss this, I'm happy to. I've not really seen this in practice in my setting. There was some description of this in trying to apply formalisms like argumentation to like a design task, where people are very visual. They're trying to like iterate on these like prototypes, and they're not really thinking about arguments, and it really got in the way. I'm not really seeing that in my setting, so I'm going to skip over this for a bit. I think the more interesting bundles are the ones about this idea of changing formalisms, right, between tasks or over time, between people, between situations. So in 3.3, they describe this as enforcing premature structure. And they sort of describe this in reference to the classic like filers and pilers paper from Tom Malone, which, yeah, makes sense, right? People don't want to commit early on. They want to keep their sort of options open, like our tabs and our like piles. But this was actually one of the more important barriers in my setting, and probably a lot of the settings you care about. This is creative knowledge work, open-ended learning, right? That sort of thing. So I'll expand a little bit more here, things that weren't in the paper. One cool paper by Kidd, the marks on the knowledge worker, is this idea of like a holding pattern for knowledge work. And this was, I don't want to do it yet, right? I don't know what it means yet, so I'm gonna keep these things in a sort of open space. I don't want to put it into a formalization or a formal categorization or folder or anything, and that's pretty important for knowledge workers. This was keyed into me by Andy Matushak. from my own background, right, there's these theories of like ideation and creative knowledge work where you have this like, actually, this is not the right figure. Let me see if I can pull it up. The right figure that's more evocative. Where are you? Where are you? No, this is the accretion theory of ideation. It's a beautiful, beautiful theory. There you go, right here. Right, so this idea is like you start off like idea fragments and like, you know, they're like not super well formed. And then part of the process of creative knowledge work is like progressively structuring these ideas into like idea symbols and idea spaces. And this is a very intuitive like theory of like how creative knowledge work proceeds. You don't have this clear schema from the beginning. You're sort of discovering it over time. So that's really, really important here, right? If we sort of impose a inappropriate formalism for creative knowledge work in the beginning, and we force people to only express things in that formalism, that's death for creativity. So really important to have the informal live alongside informal. So Conklin actually found this in his IBIS deployments back in the day. I'm actually surprised it wasn't cited in this paper. So this quote is worth reading out, right? So they try to get people to use this like issue-based information system to map out like issues and positions and potential solutions, right? And people didn't like being forced to put everything into that formalism, right? They wanted some support for recording unstructured material, which makes total sense if you think about the creative knowledge work task, right? So the phrase here, like, early phase of consideration of a writing or design problem is critical and fragile, must be allowed to proceed in a vague, contradictory, and incomplete form for as long as necessary. This is not just a laziness thing, right? This is like intrinsic to creative tasks where you must have the ability to not commit to specific formalisms yet. Right, so ultimately, it will be valuable to have teased apart these elements, but at the moment of struggling to solve a problem, the cognitive overhead required to segment the muck into discrete thoughts is prohibitive and not actually useful. So it's worth like naming this as a really important constraint. A couple more notes in here, but I won't describe it. The other thing is when you think about collaboration across people and across tasks, right? They mentioned Marshall's experiences. They actually use Aquanet to try to model like a large review of systems for machine translation. I did it for foreign machine translation efforts. And they built this like beautiful like structure with metadata for like different kinds of system attributes. And then they got upset because they couldn't apply it to like a very closely related task. And it was like, our efforts are wasted. So this idea of like formalisms changing across situations and tasks. And my general sense is that the more detailed the formalism, the harder it is to transfer across settings. It seems pretty obvious, but I also want to sort of shout out Jasmine's discussion of boundary objects, right? Often what is useful for collaboration across settings is these kind of less structured and sort of more plastic formalisms that can be travel across different boundaries. And so you don't want it to be like a really heavy ontology. So that's one failure mode. Okay, so I spent 20 minutes. Oh, not bad. Okay. I've been talking for 20 minutes. Any thoughts, reactions? I'm going to take a sip of water while I pause.
I'll just ask if the secretion, you feel it's compatible with the ladder of abstraction that not just Andy Manischek, but also Jinyi Li and other folks have been building on, using that to kind of orient us in this metaphorical space. I think of abstraction usually as granularity, but honestly, it can also be time scale, it can be physical length. So whether that's compatible with this design science formalism.
My initial reaction is I like the way Sang-Ho thinks about this as going up and down the ladder of abstraction, as opposed to like a single way, and having systems that allow us to go traverse between up and down. what the abstraction dimension actually encodes, I think, is task specific, right? Like, and so there's no like universal, like this is what abstraction means, right? In some cases, as you're right, it's granularity. Sometimes it's generalization. Sometimes it's design patterns. I don't know.
I'll go one step further and claim it's discipline specific.
Oh yeah.
And it's
So
so extraordinary.
Yeah.
Because you can bring other people in the discipline up and down with you. So what we're attributing to the notation, to the formal notation, may not actually be true. That may be the result of acculturating people for 4 years to that notation to create a discipline.
Right. Like a deeper point of like what is necessary for traversing the idea space is both the notation as cultural tool and the community of practice and culture around it for actually navigating and using that notation, right? So if you just like show somebody the notation, it's like, can you actually use it, right? But notation is like enculturation into that discipline, right? Is a way to actually
Absolutely.
use it.
And they talk about it extensively in anthropology, for instance, which often have to defend their kind of qualitative methods. So reading in that is so interesting. When they talk about innovation methods, they also talk about card sorting, which is honestly the language I would use for what we just saw with the MEMX and with the Rome Research hypergraph. I just have this, the Aquanet system feels very much like, and I've done this too, I've been like, I don't have physical index cards, I need to make this an SVG thing. Right. So it's, the practice keeps getting rediscovered because it's so darn useful, but it isn't part of our discipline as computer scientists, maybe.
Sorry?
Scientists. I feel like there's an independent reinvention of card sorting techniques in particular, which is a direct example that we've all experienced maybe of the disciplinary language, because we haven't been initiated into it, we reinvent it using new language.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. There's one disciplinary. I'll move on after like just one comment. There's this fun description of neat versus scruffy styles in semantic web that I really, really enjoy, and like the sort of desire to have a very neat ontology often precludes, as a disciplinary sort of bent, any sort of tools that begins with messy card sorts and like, things in multiple places, multiple parents. Like it's not just like, there's like sort of aesthetic, like visceral response against it if you're coming from that culture, which I think is important to name and also navigate, right? Because like what I think Shipman and Marshall are trying to claim is that you need ways to bridge those representational spaces. Cool. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that's a missing piece in the Shipman and Marshall piece, actually. Yeah, the sort of the role of culture and the community practice, for sure. So, right, the other big part of the paper was this kind of description of like, how do we deal with this as designers? And I will sort of glaze over what I think of as like sundry fairly obvious points, I think, but still worth like keeping in mind, right? Make sure your formalism fits the user and the task, right? Talk to the users and figure out what formalism actually works for their task before you design a system that forces them to use it. Make sure your formalism has payoffs, right? Don't just force them to make the structures, give them reasons that it's worth their while. Maybe use some machine learning or some other computational approach to infer structure to reduce the costs. Underrated, in my view, use expert facilitators. This, I think, this maybe is like obvious from a cultural point of view, but is not obvious from a sort of HCI individual user-centric point of view. I think that this was a big reason that Compendium was so successful for many years, is they had an explicit design pattern of, it's actually fine that this requires training, and we will give you a facilitator so you can run it in your meetings and get the benefits. I think this is an underrated design pattern, but not incremental formalization. So I'll just like point it out. The main thing that I think was interesting for us is this idea of incremental formalization, which is not that complicated idea. Right? It's you allow mostly informal entry of information, and then you defer formalization until later in the task when it's useful. When I say it out loud, it just seems so basic, but I totally missed it, right? Like you want to have these like forms and these like structures to start with, but like you really want to add formalization into a messy space over time, as opposed to forcing people to use the formalization from the beginning. That to me is the key principle, right? So they described some early examples of this. I couldn't find one of the like sad things about this research area is that a lot of these prototypes are no longer available. And some fun people at Hypertext actually bought these old machines so they could run these systems and try to archive them. So we have to sort of, for this one, just get the verbal intuition, right? Like they enter mostly informal text initially. System recognizes patterns in the textual information to suggest possible formal attributes or relations. There's a news reader system. This one's not as interesting. Wiki spatial hypertext system, right? They sort of use, let me see, spatial. Yeah, so I have these parsers that try to recognize recurring patterns of spatial organization and then suggest structures based on that in the spatial hypertext. That's how Wiki worked. And fun example from 2007 out of MIT, Michael Bernstein was involved. Journal, which is very similar to what Potluck is, right? You have this, I guess their trick was they used like a pidgin language. So they allow some informality, but some little control vocabularies in there so that the system could recognize the structures, right? Like, oh, this is a to-do, right? You can sort of recognize some of this in our patterns today, right? Like at mentioning and so on. So they sort of have these incremental formalizations alongside somewhat informal text. And the payoffs of these are like getting reminders, right? So the idea is like codex, you can create notes by inputting text in any form, and then you get sort of nice filtering, keyword search, context views as your payoff. To me, very similar to what Potluck is. Potluck is awesome. I love Potluck. I highly encourage you to try out the demo and go read the paper. In fact, I'm just gonna reiterate it in the chat here. It's really fun. It's hard to capture here. Let me see if I can. I wanted to pull it up in the browser here, just so you can see it, right? You have the ability to like write these like fairly unstructured notes, and then you have these recognizers in the background that compile it to certain structures that give you then, like you start with some things like this, and then you get like little payoffs, like if you know about dates and the attributes of like your please, then in your informal thing, the system can like highlight in red, right? Like, oh, you should probably water this plant right now, right? But you don't have to like fill out a form, right? You write out these like fairly informal to-do lists and so on, and then you have this like formalization that sort of adds on top of it over time. They call it gradual enrichment. To me, it's the same thing as incremental formalization. Yeah. So lots of like fun examples here. So those are like some intuitive examples of how it works. Let me show you like how I'm playing with it, and then I'll pause again. So to remind you, the formalization I care about is this kind of argumentation-based one, where alongside our informal notes, we want to sort of add this structure of claims, evidence, patterns, and so on. So what you're looking at is a system that has incremental formalization in it, our discourse graph plugin. So our initial version was this sort of annotation-based affordance, where if you have something you want to turn into a claim, you highlight it, you hit a hotkey, and you say, this is a claim. Then it becomes a thing of type claim that you can now link, there's some grammar to it that knows about possible relations to other things. You can sort of query it and so on. We recently added like that little pop-up that you saw to sort of make that affordance more discoverable if you want to use your mouse. That turned out to be useful, but not fully useful. So people wanted more gradations of informal formalization, right? So they don't know, like, you know, I wrote this thing, like, is it a claim, right? So we added this sort of node tags thing, where you can sort of like, you know, you write this thing, you're like, maybe it's a claim. I don't want to commit right now, but maybe it could be a claim. So you add a little annotation. And then over time, you can query these things, you can come back to them. If you encounter them again, like, okay, really, I should write this down. Then you just hover over it and say, okay, I'm going to commit now. Sangho is the smartest in HCII. Right? And then you still retain the context, right? It's non-destructive, right? You still know where it is, right? You've got all the fun things in hypertext for linking back to the context and so on. And you don't have to, we have a template in here that initializes it as like, it's not formal yet. So you can add whatever structure you like over time, but you're not committing to it right away, right? So we start with like informal text, tag it, turn it into a node, as an example of like how it's working. And this change turned out to be an extremely big win. So right now we're deploying this system across a bunch of labs and individuals and trying to learn how we can sort of scale this practice beyond our existing cohort. And this was a big unlock. So like we get people making these kind of like big emoji reactions when we show it to them. They're like, holy shit, this is what I wanted, right? This kind of goosebumps reaction. And we're seeing a lot more sort of far more useful formalization of notes into nodes, right? Like lots of things are getting captured where they weren't before in useful ways. And when you sort of go to reflect, let's say, on like a project that you have sort of a bunch of results and initial potential contributions in there. When you go to actually synthesize, there's a lot more things to gather because you have these like little candidate tags that you can at that moment formalize them. So it's really fun. So I want to highlight a couple of things that are fun from what we've learned. One is just to remember that the key principle of incremental formalization that may not be obvious is not that you want to transform in a one-way fashion, the informal to the formal, but that you have affordances for letting the formal live inside the informal space in a non-destructive way. So actually relates a bit to the sort of up and down the ladder abstraction idea, but this seems to be like a really important aspect of the incremental formalization principle, right? So generally now I'm biased towards like plugin kind of things that integrate into existing tools like whiteboards or like these kind of notebooks, as opposed to like standalone systems where the bias often is to like minimize the mess, but you really want to be in the mess. You want to be in the informal space. The other thing is that it's been fun to see like this idea of like wrong structure is not just about conceptual fit, but I think to Jasmine's point, like there's aesthetics to it, there's culture to it, right? So one fun thing was like, why didn't people create results or evidence nodes? This was a quote from one of our like users saying like, you know, often like results is just a strong term. I don't want to commit to it. Is it result worthy yet? Is it actually a result? Right, I'm not ready for it yet, but it could be, right? So it's really was a big unlock to sort of like have that way to express that partial commitment. And then, yeah, so just to highlight that one. The other thing that's fun is that in terms of payoffs, a lot of the payoffs that we saw in practice were not computational, but social. So like, what's the payoff for turning this into a claim? The HCI way of thinking about it often is like, now I get this fun computational like affordance that allows me to retrieve it or like, you know, track contradictions or whatever. But it turns out, like if you deploy this in practice, formalizing a thing into a result from your experiment is a win, right? If you have an undergrad like taking a bunch of notes and then they ran an analysis, they come to like lab meeting, and then everybody says, oh wait, that's awesome, and then they say, let me formalize this into a result. There's like a great like social payoff where they sort of have this like, oh, I made this thing, there's attribution to them, so this like big social payoff is like part of the story as well. And then like formalization as reflection as well. So these were kind of new learnings as well from deploying these that I did see described in the original paper. Okay, so those are the things I wanted to say. I'm gonna pause again and get a sense of like, what people are thinking, how they're resonating, so on. Oh, we got a hand raised.
Well, Joel, so this is very refreshing, your presentation and communication style with this document, with all the resources. It's very refreshing to see that. Thank you very much for doing this. My question was, we are seeing like lots of notebook tools, like Obsidian is one of them, Notion is one of them, which tries to give more freedom and control to the users.
Yep.
In terms of how do they, organize their notebooks in terms of creating their own structures and templates. Obsidian is particularly interesting because it gives probably more low-level controls to users. I haven't used it myself, but a lot of my students have used it for, creating links, hypercards. It gives more flexibility.
Yeah.
I was curious, like, what do you see as the biggest gap in terms of what you're articulating as a vision, like in terms of incremental formalization, doing it iteratively?
Yeah. And
where tools are right now, for instance?
Yeah, it's a great question. I skipped over this one. So kind of back to like the things that Marshall and Roger saw with Aconet, right? I think people are often happy to make nodes, but like specifying these more complex like relational structures, I think is still like an open problem. So actually, do I have this in my? I have like some figures to show from here. Yeah. So from our deployments, right? We see the same thing, right? People are just like, I know what it means, right? If I indent this thing under this other thing, and it's a claim and evidence, it means it supports it. But the system doesn't know that, right? And so if you like export the graph, you see this dense like untyped linkages between things. But if you filter it down to like typed relationships, it becomes like that. So I don't think we've got the interaction right yet. The interaction in our system right now is very heavy. We had this hypothesis that we could sort of get people to, specify these structures, kind of inspired by the wiki parsers, right? We can sort of allow people to specify these like relation patterns. Super heavy, right? This is like essentially a query over the graph. Is like, if you have a graph if you have a node pattern that looks like this, then we infer that there's a supports relationship between this claim and evidence. There's no way people can remember this. Like people often like they can't modify it. Like so, it didn't really work out very well, except in very niche cases. Sometimes on the whiteboards they will draw those edges, and that kind of works out. Generally now, I still think there needs to be some way to think about payoffs, which is just like not just like what do you get from the formalization, but in what context does it pay off? So something we're thinking about is when you are, say, sharing with other people outside your lab, you want to share these notes and you want some way to manage what gets shared. That could be a moment where we could sort of recognize some structure. Another one might be when you're outlining and you want to sort of gather a bunch of ideas, right? You could sort of have a, general like suggestive, right? We have this prototype right here of like suggested discourse notes, and we want to sort of add some predictions for like discourse relations, like find contradictory evidence or find supporting evidence. And then at that moment, you could find it useful to have that, and you can sort of like add that explicit structure. So it's still an open question. We have some ideas. Generally, we think AI is going to be involved somehow, but also careful design of like the specific settings in which this will pay off. To me, this is the biggest thing. It's like nodes, I think, are fairly solved. People like are happy to make a bunch of nodes, but we haven't quite figured out where the payoffs are going to be for adding the links. The other thing I'll say is like not just in terms of problems, but like real opportunities. I don't know if you're tracking this, like Claude Code used on top of Obsidian is like a thing. It's pretty fun to see, right? Because it's markdown files, right? So you just like open Claude in your vault, and then you have a specification of the fault structure. You can use a discourse graph schema and say, I care about these kinds of things, and that can be a spec for the agent to do gardening for you. Many people have gotten a lot of value out of this to sort of like get away from the feeling of I have to like manage my notes to get value out of it. So I think there's like a nice opportunity space here. So actually, can I make this? Yes, this page can be read by anyone. So if you link to this, you can see all this too. Yeah, so those are the two things I see as like the frontiers that we're thinking about right now.
Matt also has a hands raised. But,
Yeah. You talked a lot about this notion of having a payoff. And I feel like the flip side of a payoff is that there needs to be like an impetus to like actually take the action of like taking the formalism step. And I feel like there's the distance between the impetus and the payoff is important. So like in the Potluck example, I feel like the impetus for like augmenting the date is that you have like an idea of like how it can be done, and the payoff seems like pretty close to that. My sense is that with these like knowledge management systems, the payoff is like pretty distant, right? It's like, oh, at some point in the future, I don't even know when I'm going to want to search for this in a particular way, and that's going to be that. And so that means that like not only is the payoff far away, but maybe it's big, maybe it's small. But it also means that like there needs to be a point where in your mind you're like, oh, this is worth doing. And I'm curious how you think about that for like, the tagging is like small enough of an action that maybe it's not so bad. But still, it's something you have to like, there needs to be something that changes for you to decide to actually take the step. And I'm curious how you've thought about that.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it. So I thought about distance at a much larger scale, which is typically we tell people to use these formalizations in like scientific settings for the good of science, right? For like some unspecified like open commons, right? Which you often actually literally never get to see the payoff, right? And so like the distance is max, like infinite. And so like the move that we're making is like make it tangible to you. We've not thought as much about like minimizing the distance between impetus and payoff, but more about making sure that there's a credible like sort of loop that executes. So one loop is I take experiment logs, I tag potential results, and I know that at some point I will present in lab meeting. And then at some point after that, we will make sense of what we've learned from our experiment so far. And that there's that sort of like logical sort of link. So it's not so much about like minimizing the time, but like you have a clear expectation that it will pay out at some point in your lifetime, I guess, or like in the like on the order of like weeks or months, like it's fine. It turns out to be fine. So that's something we've seen. If you don't have that credible story, then yeah, you tag the thing and you never see it again, and like it doesn't really matter. But we have this sort of like functional loops within labs and within your sense making workflows. Another one would be you read a bunch of papers and then you're trying to then make sense of it so you can write your argument, right? So there's that sort of link as well.
Yeah, so I guess one of the impetus can be almost like habitual, right? So this is the sort of thing that I do in my notes, which might be like kind of the best case scenario for like a designer. It's like, oh yes, the user will do it because they're used to doing it. That'd be great. But I think there's something a little bit different in like the habit of presenting at lab meetings implies that like when you're writing your notes, like you're writing them for a specific purpose. It's kind of like making slides, right? Like you make a bunch of small, low-level decisions because you have a bigger plan.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I did incremental formalization for this chat, right? Because like, hey, I want to gather the thoughts. It's useful to like, oh, I keep referencing this thing. It's annoying for me to like, I can't show it because it's in my brain. So let me just like write it down. So that's like another natural like sort of impetus payoff loop. I like that term. Thank you. Impetus payoff loop. Before we run out of time, I want to highlight that we are recruiting for a study of a new incremental formalization system for brainstorming meetings. I will post it in the chat. This like sort of allows you to review recordings of your brainstorming meetings in the formalization. Yes, Calvin is on the call. Calvin is leading the study. Details will follow. If you're also interested in trying our system, we have this in Obsidian. So I'll also post a link in the chat as well. And the larger vision is that people have their own formalisms in their Obsidian vaults, and then you have some protocol for them to exchange knowledge using this formalism. Yeah, and then there's like project links down there to learn more. So just before we run out of time, just want to highlight that. And I'm happy to share any and all things from here with people. I have a query of all the discourse notes on this page, and I'm happy to export to Markdown, CSV, PDFs for people to play with if they want to.
It seems I don't know if others were able to be successful. When I click on the links, it doesn't take me to that specific page. I don't know.
Yeah, because not all of them are shared.
Right. Yeah. I figured, but yeah.
That's one limitation of a hypertext system is the permissioning is very heavy, right? That should be a primitive for like, if I put this in the shared space and let me control like how many hops out things will be shared or whatever. Yeah. But I'm happy to share whatever you request. Yeah. I just, this is our lab notebook. So like, I didn't tell my students that I will be sharing the whole lab notebook with everybody. Like we actually run our lab on this notebook. And so we have like, our regular weekly meetings in here. So I don't want to make it open to everybody.
Yeah. Do you want to share the link to this Obsidian like a plugin or in the chat? I will also add it to our Discord channel.
Oops, not that one. Documentation. Oh, I haven't looked at the Discord at all.
Oh yeah, no, it's fine.
Joel, you mentioned earlier this sense that there's this tremendous value in kind of living in the informal, and the formalization kind of lives within the sea of informality.
Yeah,
that really makes me think of like design studios, where you have a lot of what looks like chaos, right? Because those are the early like discoveries. They haven't actually like condensed into the matter they will ultimately become. But then, in many design studios, you also have a library. And you'll even have a librarian. It might be materials, it might be information.
Oh yeah.
Right. And so you get to see this whole spectrum of like the power that comes from those, not only the polarity, but all the gradation in between. And it makes me realize that for me, doing creative development, like the ideas are all kind of loose and mysterious and informal until all of a sudden they snap together, and then you could actually describe it formally. And so it really makes me wonder, like in the world of LLMs, because of the magic they do kind of predicting next token, what is the amount of tagging, what informal formalizing can you do so that then an LLM could actually just kind of give you a view? Like this formalizing kind of become like filtering. Like I want to see it from this perspective. I want to see it from that perspective.
Full stop formalization. My secret goal is to inception everybody on the Discord to explore this because I think it's very powerful, because this has been a trade-off that's been around for ages in HCI, right? Like, I think we have got opportunities to like really take a swing at this problem in you right now in interesting ways. Yeah, totally agree.
And I think we see it in the commercial products as well, right? It's Notion is awesome. It's like a blank page. But how does Notion successfully sell Notion? With this huge open source community of template makers, because most users need a vessel to put their thoughts into,
Yep.
but that vessel has to be informal enough. It's like you need a floor plan. Like I need to know there's a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room, and a bedroom, and then I can kind of do an informal sort into it. Like
Yeah.
but it's formal. I don't know. The words are hard for me because it's
Yeah, I'll say one thing that I think why I think that we should work on this is that a common failure mode is to pretend that we didn't just throw away all the structure, right? So we sort of like dump all our stuff into this like mess, and then we trust the LLMs to like get all the structure we need out of it. And like the key insight in HCI is that we want some kind of shared representation, some kind of like persistence of the formalization. So like navigating that trade-off is like something for us to like really be thoughtful about instead of just like putting all the eggs in the giant hyperparameter space of the model.
Yeah.
You mentioned the paper, the marks are on the practitioner, right?
Yep.
My takeaway from that paper is actually that most of the value in creating knowledge artifacts comes from the creation process and almost not at all from reviewing the process. And this is actually like pretty important because I think it means that LMs actually don't solve the structure problem, because most of the value of using the structure is in creating it, because in creating it, it makes you think about it, makes you reflect on it, and you'll probably remember parts of it. Obviously, there's benefits to being able to search it and so on.
Yeah.
But the punchline of that paper is that like people have these like generate all of these artifacts, but they never look back at them. And when I think about how I use Notion, like 90% of my usage is writing stuff. There's like writing into it. I almost never check back on things that I write down. And so I would be cautious about saying like, yes, the LM can just like complete things for it, because then you actually like, it means you don't get almost all of the value out of it.
Yeah. I'm being recorded, but I'm comfortable saying this. I think that the evidence in the Kit paper is weak for how broad the claims are, but I think it's evocative for sure. Like it will resonate with some of our experiences. I think like a good like turnkey to help like navigate this idea, which I agree with. Like I think like there's an important part to it. There's this idea of like expressive versus documentary functions of externalizations that was like studied by CSCW back in the day, that I think is very important as well. Like there's definitely a huge portion of the benefit of like throwaway artifacts, right? Creating things whose value is just in the making, but not in the documentation of it. But then there's some things that are important documentary functions, articulation work for collaboration, and so on. And so that's I think an important turnkey. But I think that the point that you're making about there is a lot of value in doing the generation, that if we offload that to something else, we're losing a lot. I totally agree with that.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I was just thinking like, so right now I'm like working on a project where trying to support the research ideation process, but it's like more of like a free form. It should be a little bit more unstructured, but I'm wondering in that like we're trying to find some gaps or like trying to connect the researcher with analogous conceptual challenges that other researchers in other disciplines are working on and how they approach the problem. But I'm wondering if now the researcher is trying to do this ideation in more of an unstructured manner. And a lot of what we talked about today is where they're producing the content. Now, if you kind of have this automatic process that's introducing, ideas or whatever from other disciplines, does that disrupt the process too much? I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah, there's an agency component to it that maybe is interesting.
Yeah.
But the thing that my head went to first actually is like, is this possibility of exploring lots of different formalizations before you commit to them, and having not just ideas but schemas and formalization and ways of thinking about things from other disciplines can be extremely generative, especially if you don't have sunk costs associated with it. So yeah, that's where my headspace goes first.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because like the thing that I found the most helpful at least in the process of designing that project, is it kind of introduces me to terminology from other disciplines. Like, for example, today, like I didn't know about the accretion theory of ideation, which was super cool. So like introducing you to formalizations and terminologies in other disciplines, but hopefully not having it be introduced in a disruptive way to your design process, maybe. Thanks so much. Yeah, great talk.
Great. I know we're over time. And yeah. Oh, sorry, Jasmine. Do you?
Yeah, I'm
wanna
happy to
pick
stay
them
for
up?
at least Jasmine's comment.
Yeah, I don't want to
Cool.
keep anyone. So if you want to like close the container somehow, and then
I mean, if Joe's okay, and yeah, I mean, yeah, go ahead.
You have the last word, Jasmine.
I wanted to throw in the design study kind of ideation framework from visualization as another of these related conceptual frameworks. I know Paul Parsons' lab in Indiana has done work on this, particularly Prakash Shukla, who just shared a bunch of his dissertation research at Viz this year, where he's gone and interviewed designers to learn, visualization designers to learn about how they reason through their data. So the advantage, of course, of framing it this way, that's data, right? It came from a structured place.
Yeah.
And then you're melting it and then formalizing it again.
Yeah.
And more than that, there's a lot of discussion from like Mariah Meyer's work as well in visualization of how design study enables this. So if we're looking for these parallel strands of sense making, that's one that's that's in the big HCI tent.
Yeah.
That has had some really good labs working on it for many years now.
I'm very eager to read those. It's not a lot. But yeah.
Yeah, I'll
Yes.
happily send you all those links.
Yeah. I'm happy to share back as well. I'll collect it in this page. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Yeah, thank you. Let's give a round of applause for Joel. Thank you. Thank you so much for awesome talk, and also for giving us an opportunity to discuss these. I think it was been really fun, and I think everyone enjoyed it. And we can kind of continue the discussion on Discord too. So please ask questions, and let's engage in kind of exchanging our insights and thoughts. With that, I will end, and everyone have a good weekend and rest of the day.
Yep. Stay warm.
Right.
Stay safe.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.